Hi everyone. For week 2, we're looking at subsidies and tradable pollution permits, or TPP. And then we'll also compare last week's topic, taxes, to tradable pollution permits. And these are all in the sub-theme of market-based instruments. And so let's start with subsidies. So again, it's important to frame this under the topic of why pollution. Um, the basic economic processes that happen regarding pollution are production and consumption, and the conversion of natural resources by firms into goods. And We know that this conversion is not optimal or efficient. It's not perfect, so byproducts are produced. And if there's no economic value, those are waste. And then waste arises at all points in the economic process. And so these are the assumptions that environmental economics makes on classical or mainstream economics. They, you can find uh, holes in these arguments, I'm sure, and we'll look at those later on. But it kind of takes the assumption that without economic incentives, it would be very difficult to control our levels of pollution using our current economics system, especially that it will be too costly for the producer. So that's why government intervention is needed. Okay, so subsidies are forms of financial government support for activities that are believed to be environmentally friendly. And so rather than charging a polluter for emissions like a tax, a subsidy rewards a polluter for reducing emissions. So they aim to change relative prices. They're usually given to the producer. They can also be used to internalize positive externalities, and they can be used to help redistribute income. So you want to make sure that energy efficiency companies or in alternative technologies of energy are better supported in the market. You can give money to them. It's also used to help firms compete. So say you want, the solar sector in your state or region or a country to be strong, you could offer them subsidies to help them start creating more um, solar companies and market share in that area. So there's numerous examples, like in agriculture, heavily subsidized in Scotland, transport sector, electric cars, for example, efficient machinery for factories that want to abate um, more, have more abatement of pollution, clean passenger cars, uh, again, like in France, buses, heavily subsidized electric buses in China. Also, HGV vehicles, waste collection. You can find many examples. Also, subsidies pay the polluter for each unit that is reduced, and that will reduce as long as the per unit of subsidy is more than the cost of abatement, and it will reduce the pollution to the point where the subsidy is equal to the marginal abatement cost. So the effects of subsidies, they shift the supply curve to the right, and they reduce the price to the consumer. Um, they increase the output, so increase the amount of goods, and because market failure is perceived as a lack of output. They have a long-term effect on the market. It kind of distorts the real true price, if you will, of the free market because there's this extra uh, payment coming into the company that isn't accounted for under normal business practices from the government. And who benefits depends on who gets the subsidy and how it is used. Um, we also have welfare effects. The cost of the subsidy to the taxpayer is minus the value of the benefits received. And there's an impact on relative consumer and producer surplus, so the amount of goods, both on the production side and the consumption side. So essentially, it transfers resources towards the polluter. Possibly that could increase the initial amount of pollution to get a larger subsidy. So you could have a lot of cash flow coming in to a company that pollutes and wants to pollute more because it knows a subsidy is coming in that can help it either change its business practices or abate that pollution. And subsidies can make firms more profitable, more so than under a tax system. Okay, now we're going to take a look at tradable pollution permits or TPPs. Tradable pollution permits are also called cap and trade schemes. They give companies a legal right to pollute a certain amount per fixed time span. And firms that pollute less can then sell their leftover pollution permits to firms that want to pollute more. So in essence, they are another market-based instrument or economic incentive to try to internalize the externality. So the initial allocation of tradable pollution permits, they're auctioned or grandfathered according to previous levels, or they're equally auctioned off. And although from an efficiency viewpoint, the initial allocation is irrelevant because the market will eventually work and decide based on bids and offers between companies, and that will be the invisible hand of the free market, as Adam Smith would say. So, from an equity viewpoint, it's important that in terms of the auction, the substantial initial cost for polluter and revenue is provided for by the government, and also like being grandfathered in on historical levels rewards or creates an asset for polluters. So you have to make sure that if you're grandfathered in, that it's not there's a mechanism that allows for those companies not to just trade at that certain pollution rate, and have that locked in, and that cannot be changed. So to recap, the allocation of tradable pollution permits can be on the basis of historical pollution levels. They can be auctioned, or they can be distributed by a lottery or allocated by a combination of different schemes. And there's a lot of case study examples, of course, in Europe, like Canada and California and China. Okay, now we're going to look at Pigovian taxes uh, and compare and contrast them to tradable pollution permits. So a Pigovian tax is a tax on the generator or the producer of negative externalities. And it's named after Arthur Pigou, and these taxes are exactly the same as last week's topic, but in that week I just called them taxes, so I guess I'm trying to get more fancy as the course goes on. So the pros and cons of Pigovian taxes versus tradable pollution permits. Uh, the accommodation to industry change. So with TPPs, there's no need to interfere when the number of polluters changes. The new entrants will simply buy permits. There's also the accommodation to inflation. So with taxes, you have to adjust for inflation, and that can be costly and take time and resources from a labor standpoint um, and financial standpoint. But with TPP, there's no need for the state to interfere or to do inflation adjustments because the free market for those permits will automatically adjust prices because companies' um, business bottom line and kind of balance sheets are all tied in with selling and buying of the pollution permits. So of course they want to get a better deal and not cost their shareholders or their company's revenue. Also, TPP has an acceptability to the industry. Historically, firms are used to command and control legislation. You might remember that this is about regulations and penalties. Command and control is just, the government signs in something and then it has to be abide. That's the law, and everybody has to deal with that. And TPP simply presets standards, so it's possible to modify, uh, which are possible to modify with purchasing and selling. So the pros and cons of Pigovian taxes. So there's cons um, that include public revenue. So taxes distort the economy, but the need to raise public revenue could be met by internalizing pollution uh, externality and satisfying the polluter pays principle. So it's important to take a look at that polluter pays principle to have a better understanding of what that entails. And there's impediments to trade TPP. So there's a lot of research costs for firms to obtain uh, a tradable pollution permit. And for the next unit, it is more economical to uh, A, produce more, emit more pollution and pay tax, or B, abate, so find a way to minimize the cost of the next unit of production. And then there's also hoarding. So companies can, in the long term or short term game, keep permits as a strategic mechanism to restrict competition and try to drive maybe some of their competitors out of the market, and or put up a barrier so stop other companies from entering the market. So with market-based instruments, in essence, with all these MBIs or economic incentives, you assume that polluters all have different marginal abatement costs, and uh, and these curves are then different for each of these companies. And with the Pigovian tax or tradable pollution permits, you try to collapse them all in a social marginal abatement cost curve whereby you can equalize the costs accordingly so that bigger polluters, smaller polluters, etc., they all have to abide by the same costs and it's a level playing field. You want this is going to be described as when the abatement cost is equal to the society's damage costs. So the costs that are for the company are compatible with the damage costs that society is willing to endure. And this is to obtain ultimately the socially optimal level of pollution. So where it's the balance between consumption and production is equitable with society's desire for environmental protection and management. And so here's another graph that shows the socially optimal level of pollution, represented by the purple box and the purple line leading up in the middle of the schematic. On the y-axis is the cost from 0 at the bottom, and as you go up, the prices get higher. And on the x-axis, there is pollution output from any kind of factory or business or commercial operation, like a mining enterprise, if you will, that's extracting ore from a mountainside or something like that. And we can see that as the company limits the amount of pollution generated, the costs go up. So the socially optimal level of pollution is where the marginal social abatement cost is equal to the marginal social damage cost. And if you would like to see a more in-depth description, I highly advise that you watch on Moodle Policy Instruments and the Socially Optimal Level of Pollution. And you can watch this from about the 9-minute, 8-minute 50 mark to about the 16-minute mark. Give you a detailed analysis of the socially optimal level of pollution in relation to MAC curves and what this means in kind of a practical sense. It's from our colleague who teaches the MSc course in Aberdeen on environmental protection management. Also, make sure to find an article relating to subsidies and tradable pollution permits and post them to the discussion board along with a summary of the article. I'll post the first one so that you can see an example. Okay, see you later.